There's a battle playing out for our very humanness. It sets the context for every event that is unfolding in our world. There's something deep within each of us, so powerful, so precious, that nations will go to war with other nations to keep us distracted. There is a movement to replace our bodies with synthetics, chemicals in the blood, sensors under the skin, computer chips in the brain, artificial intelligence. It steals from us our ability to access this part of us. We're about to give our humanness away to the technology before we even know what it means to be fully human. And we are more than we've been led to believe. So I want to be very clear. Evolution is a fact. It breaks down when it comes to humans. Something happened. Scientists now know this, but they don't know what to do with what they have found. The way that it happened is that it's by crossing the traditional boundaries that we gain new wisdom that leads us beyond the boxes. We owe it to ourselves to find out who we are and what it means to be human before we give it away forever. But here's the beauty.
Everyone, welcome back to Know Thyself. Today we have the pleasure and honor and privilege to sit down with a 5-time New York Times bestselling author, a former geologist by degree, and somebody who is an international educator in human potential and social politics and science. And he's one of the most prominent, pivotal thought leaders, I personally believe, for giving context of where we're currently at right now in terms of humanity, where we come from, where we're going. And this conversation is going to be filled with reflections on transhumanism, the fight for our own divinity and humanity. We're going to be exploring the possibility of where we came from, ancient civilizations, and much, much more. So Gregg Braden, thank you so much for being here.
Andre, I am so excited to be with you. It's the first time we have worked together, first time I've had the privilege of working with you. This is completely unscripted. I have no idea where we're going to go, and that's what makes it so exciting. And if I can say, it's a very auspicious day. The eclipse happened on my drive over and set the tone for everything we're going to do today. So thank you for the invitation. And my brother, this is a dance. I'm going to follow your lead.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's follow the powerful energy of the solar eclipse today. And, I want to start out with this reflection and hear your thoughts on what is this battle for our humanity and our humanness that is such an important reflection as the inevitable advent and rise of AGI and merging of technology with human biology is upon us and is happening day by day now. New things are unfolding. I would love for you to set the context of what that battle is.
You know, it's a perfect place to begin because truly it is the umbrella under which every event, bar none, in our lives and our world is unfolding. There's a battle. It's an ancient battle. Some people would frame it as a battle between good and evil, or light and dark, originally perceived as good and evil. Ultimately, light and dark are simply energies until we give them the significance that we give to them. But there isn't an ancient battle playing out. It's not an obsolete battle. It's playing out before our very eyes today. And it sets the context for every event that is unfolding in our world. And so this is a perfect place to begin. We all know there's a battle for our thoughts. That's obvious. If you watch any network news, we've got commentators trying to tell us what to think and how to perceive the events in our lives. Most people know that. There's a battle for our beliefs. It's been playing out for a while in mainstream classrooms, mainstream textbooks. For example, how did the universe begin? Is it a conscious and intelligent beginning, or is it an inert, dead, random process that we're living in? How did we begin? And we'll talk about this. Are we the product of random mutations and lucky biology, as we're led to believe? Is there something else going on there? Those things are important, but they're all part of an even deeper battle. There is a battle for our very humanness that is unfolding right now. And the humanness is the vehicle that allows an even deeper experience, Andre. And that experience, for any of our viewers that may wonder how relevant this conversation really is, there's something deep within each of us that is so powerful, so precious, so sacred, so beautiful, that nations will go to war with other nations to keep us distracted so that we don't know what this power is all about. Armies will defeat armies. Pandemics will be unleashed. We will see the collapse of societies. We will see the collapse of financial systems, all in an effort to keep us distracted from the sacredness of this power within us. So I'm going to use a word and then we'll define it. It is the power of human divinity that is only possible through the biological body. And this is one of the reasons there's such a move to replace our biology with synthetics and artificial intelligence. So the word is divinity. It is divine, our divine nature. Now, when I use that word in public audiences, many people assume it has something to do with religion, and I can see why, because there are schools for divinity where religion is taught. But if you look at the definition of divinity, it's a deceptively simple definition, and it simply says that divinity is the power within us to transcend perceived limitations. And that's it. So I can see where religion would be wrapped around that concept, the idea to transcend perceived limitations. I'm going to break this down just a little bit. The idea of transcendence, it means not just to survive, but to become greater than, to become more than whatever it is that life brings to our doorstep, the challenge that life brings to our doorstep. So our ability to transcend perceived limitations, they may not even be real. They are the limitations that we have placed upon ourselves through our culture and our society, through our textbooks, through false science, through our culture, our religion, but they may not even be real. So our divinity is the ability to become more than the worst challenges that life brings to our doorstep. The reason it is such a powerful force within us is because through our divinity, among the things we transcend is fear. Divinity is what empowers us to transcend our own fears. If we, as individuals and as a society, are not kept in fear, we are very, very difficult to control. Because without the fear, we have the freedom to love, create, innovate, express. These are all features of divinity. I just want to give some examples of what divinity is all about, because for some people, it's this esoteric concept. Everyday divinity, we express it every day in our lives. I had the opportunity, 2016, I went to the Grammy Music Awards, and they held them in New York that year. My wife is a voting member in the Grammys, and she invited me, and I said yes.
It's very kind of her.
It was very kind, and I took advantage of the opportunity, and I met amazing people there. And every opportunity I had, I would ask the musicians and the producers. I would say, when you wrote this amazing piece of music, or when the words for this song came through, can you tell me where did they come from? And every one of them, Andre, everyone to the T gave me the same answer. Everyone said, it did not come from me. It came through me, from somewhere else. Every one of them said they had to find a way to get out of the way, to allow this deep inspiration to come through them. That is a familiar facet of divinity. Artists say the same thing. If you talk to an artist, who's done an amazing, or a sculptor, or a poet, they say the same thing. As a writer, I have had this experience where I don't know what I'm going to write, and I sit down and give myself the opportunity of either a blank piece of paper, or now it's a blank computer screen, and become very empty so that I can become very full of whatever it is that's going to come through. These are expressions of divinity. Divinity is a part of us. Our divinity is the part of us that's ancient, it's timeless, it's ageless. It is where our creativity, our intuition, our imagination comes from. And it's what sets us apart from every other form of life. And as we get in deeper into the biology of how it works, we can only access our divinity through our bodies, through the DNA antenna of our bodies, in the cellular structure of our bodies. There is a movement to replace our bodies, the transhuman movement, to replace our bodies with synthetics, with chemicals in the blood, sensors under the skin, computer chips in the brain, artificial intelligence. And by virtue of doing so, it steals from us our ability to access this part of us, our divinity. So what we're seeing playing out in the world today, whether you're looking at Ukraine and Russia and the role of America, or you're looking at the Middle East, you're looking at Israel and the Palestinian tragedy, that is the horrors that are happening there, and you look at everything happening all around that, people tend to think these are isolated, spontaneous events. And people say to me, wow, isn't it amazing all these things are happening right now? They're happening now because the battle for our divinity has intensified to such a degree that these are the events that it takes to keep us from that inner focus. Now, I'm not saying that everyone, every politician, every leader of every nation certainly is aware of what I'm saying. Many of them are pawns in this ancient battle of good and evil, of light and dark. They don't even know that they're pawns because they're so wrapped up in the bubble of the level that they are playing this very dark game within. But when you begin to step back and you look at the big picture, the evidence supports the story, and it's very clear that this battle is playing out. And the interesting thing to me, when you use the term battle, it's probably no longer even a good word, because in battle, it implies conflict. I believe that we now are at a point in our lives and our consciousness where we have the ability and the awareness to transcend. This is our divinity. If you don't engage in the battle, if you transcend the battle, then that is how not win, but triumph. When we talk about winning and losing, we're stuck in that old paradigm. We don't want to win or lose. We want to triumph, to become more than. And the way that we do this is so interesting to me, is by living the best version of our lives, living the best version of ourselves, fully expressing, perhaps for the first time in human history, what it actually means to be human. And Andre, what the science is telling us is we don't even know what it means to be fully human because we've never expressed the depth and the breadth of our complete humanness. So as we move through this time in history, there are some that allow themselves to become engaged in the distractions and the diversions, and others who are recognizing it's not that we discount what's happening and not that we say it's not important. It's all important. But there is a science, there is a skill, and there is an art to rising above, living, becoming the best version of ourselves, and in that way, doing just what the definition of divinity says, transcend our perceived limitations. So I'd like to say this to set the context. Everything we're seeing in our lives today, even the things that so many of my friends, the social justice things that are important and they're really wrapped up in, for example, in the United States, the pronoun conversation, what pronouns are we using, the transgender conversation, abortion conversation, gay rights conversation, all these are important, but if you look closely at what's happening, the races, black against white, Christian against Muslim, Jew against Muslim, the rich against the poor, these are all really important conversations that go right to the gut, man. They cut right to the core of our most primal instincts. And if we don't know how we are being engaged, then we will respond on that primal level. They're important conversations. They have been skillfully weaponized to divide us and keep us separate from one another, to break the social bonds that have always kept families and communities and societies and nations together. There's an intentional effort to break those bonds, and sadly, it appears to be working well to some degree because we're allowing it. We're allowing ourselves to be played, to be pawns in this ancient game. So the conversations are important, and I don't want to diminish the significance of those conversations. it's also important to recognize that the topics have been weaponized. And rather than having conversations in kindness to become closer as brothers and sisters in the global family, the differences that we used to celebrate as our strength have now become the differences that are being used, being weaponized to divide us and keep us in our fear. And it is divinity that allows us to transcend that fear. So when you think about this, all of a sudden it becomes really clear why a dark power would want to keep us in that fear, because we become powerless victims in that fear. And as victims, we need a savior. And technology is now being touted as our savior. We're being told that we are flawed as humans by virtue of our existence. Emotion is one of our flaws. The inability to make clear, logical decisions without having emotion. Empathy is considered to be a flaw by transhumanists. Sickness, illness, death is considered to be a flaw by transhumanists. And we are programming our young people to believe that they are broken and flawed from the time of birth, and that they are victims of something beyond their control. And if you're a victim, you need a savior. And the savior, we're being told, is technology, computer chips in the brain, artificial intelligence, sensors under the skin, AI that knows us better than we know ourselves. And when you begin to understand the big picture, and I'm covering a lot of ground here intentionally because we'll tie into this, when you begin to understand the big picture, all of a sudden, the power of human divinity becomes something more than a casual academic peripheral conversation. It's front and center for everything that's happening in our lives today. And the beauty is you don't have to know that, but you can simply live the best version of yourself and transcend the efforts to keep us small and separate and insignificant. So does that make sense if I say it that way?
Absolutely.
It's a long answer to a short question.
I think it's important to really set the stage because not everybody also understands to the degree in which this is currently transpiring in society and this fight for our own humanity. And with this transhuman movement and the exponential rise of various technologies from food engineering to CRISPR technology, gene editing, AI, there's both incredible promise that these technologies brings in solving a lot of issues that is incredible. And yet at the same time, you spoke to the part as we continue to merge technology in our human biology, there's aspects of ourselves that we start to lose access to, that start to atrophy within ourselves. Sure. And so I'd love for you to set the stage too of, because not everybody realizes where we're currently at in terms of this, and the dangers and the promise, because there's both. I mean, just this past month, we saw the first Neuralink patient successfully be able to control computer mouse with his brain, and is a quadriplegic, and there's incredible things for that as well.
This is part of a very old conversation. Some of our listeners may be familiar with my work. Some not. I'm a scientist. I'm a degreed earth scientist, my first degree, and I worked in the corporations as a problem solver from 1979 until the early 1990s. And so I had and I say this because I had the opportunity to work alongside brilliant scientists. I mean, physicists, mathematicians, engineers, just amazing, amazing people, and see amazing technology. And that'll be important in our conversation here in just a moment. But there was a part of this conversation that would typically happen around the coffee machine and the drinking fountain and in the break room, where the scientists and the engineers would get together. And the conversation would typically go like this. There was one group that would always say, because we can do these things, because we've had the insight to develop these extraordinary technologies, that gives us the right to use them. That gives us the right to implement them. If we were never meant to implement them, we never would have figured it out. And during the Cold War years, when this was around weapons technology, this is a very important conversation. There's another school of thought, another group of scientists say, oh, hold on, not so fast. Just because we can doesn't mean we should. just because we can do these things, maybe we ought to reel it in a little bit and think about the moral implications or what it means to our values in society. That conversation has never been resolved. It's an ongoing conversation right now. So it's like the gas and the brakes. On the one hand, we are going full bore, exploring the deepest mysteries of the universe and of life itself. And now we have the ability, as some people say, to hack the physics of the universe and to hack the biology of human life or all life. And once you do that, the proverbial genie is out of the bottle. You're never going to go back. Once you develop it, you're never going to undevelop it. Probably not going to set it on a shelf somewhere. You're going to use it and implement it some way. So the other piece of this is what I saw very quickly is technology isn't good or bad or right or wrong. It's the thinking that underlies the society when the technology is being developed. During World War II and the Cold War years, we poured tremendous amounts of energy and human power, human intellect, and money and technology into pushing the boundaries of what we know. And we discovered beautiful things like how to split the atom. Unfortunately, it was within the context of wartime that application was used for a weapon, when we all know there's so many beautiful things that can come from that. And the same is happening with transhumanism. There are places, and you just mentioned one. Elon Musk has a company called Neuralink, and it's actually been around for a while. And they are the first to develop the computer chip. It's not actually in the brain. It's interesting. It sits in a space above the brain and below the bone. And there's a little space in there. And there are 128 microfibers that go down into the neocortex. And they pick up information. There's sensors. Pick up information from the neurons, bring it back to the chip, and the chip then processes it and sends it through essentially a Bluetooth-type technology to the computer with no wires. That can be a beautiful thing for servicemen and women who have lost arms and legs and in the battlefields halfway around the world, Afghanistan, Iraq, to give a man or woman the ability to hold their babies in their arms once again with their prosthetics, or to brush their own teeth or comb their own hair or feed themselves. But what a beautiful, beautiful thing. And that's one of the good things that can come from all of this. There are now proposals on the table, governmental agencies proposing by the year 2030 that all newborns be implanted with a computer chip in the brain. They say to give them the edge in business and in technology and to be able to compete successfully in life. And when I say this to a live audience, I mean, I can see people's eyes. They say, not my babies. We don't want this. So there's a part of us. This is the generation, Andre. It's not going to drag on forever. We're at this pivotal point where the technology is at this stage where we are now making a decision. And I'm fascinated by this because it's never happened before. We now have the ability to make decisions that will not change so much the world around us, but the world within us forever in ways that can never be reversed. This goes all the way down to the genetic level. And when we define human through a very specific quality of DNA, we now have on the table proposals for medications, for different kinds of medical applications that will forever change who we are genetically. And we don't even know what that means. We don't even know what it means to be human. We're about to give our humanness away to the technology before we even know what it means to be fully human. I'm not saying it's right, wrong, good, or bad. I have my own personal feelings, but my sense is we owe it to ourselves as a species to find out who we are and what it means to be human before we give it away forever. But here's the beauty. I think when we discover the deep truth of what it means to be human and the power within the human cell and within our own divinity, we will feel less need and less drawn to bring that external technology into our bodies because we are the technology, literally. This is why I said what I said just a moment ago. When I was in the industry, I worked on a project called SDI, Star Wars Defense Initiative. It was back in the 1980s. And even then, we had the most amazing laser systems and radar systems and communication systems and computer systems. And who knows, where they are now. They've come so much further. But here's the thing, as advanced as every one of them were, I have never, to this day, I've never seen a technology developed outside of our bodies that doesn't mimic what we already do in some capacity within the cells and the systems of our bodies, except we do it better. We do it better. And so that's a big statement. Let me just share what I mean by that. Let's take computer chips in the brain. When I'm with a live audience, and a lot of young people come to our programs, and they've been taught to worship the computers and the AI and computer chips are God. I mean, literally, that's what they've been taught. And when I say to a young person, and I have a really very honest conversation, computer chips are fast. Absolutely, they're fast. Efficient, totally. I mean, I'm with you on that. I was a senior computer systems designer for a company called Martin Marietta Defense Systems. And I was with the computers day and night, and they are impressive machines. So I'm not denigrating that in any way. But here's the thing. A computer chip will always be limited in its function by the physics of the stuff it's made of. So the atoms of silicon, for example, the space between those atoms only allows information to travel so fast between that space. And once that limit is reached, it can't be scaled. So that is the upper limit. They've reached the capacity for that computer chip. Now you look at a human neuron and you say, well, what is the upper limit on the human neuron? And the answer is we don't know. And here's the reason. This is so beautiful. Because every time we think we reach the capacity of a neuron to hold or transmit information, what happens is that neuron adapts and it morphs, it shifts, it changes to accommodate the greater capacity that we're asking it to do. We don't know what the top end is because every time we reach it, we exceed it. That's part of our humanness. And when young people begin to understand that, we don't have any chips that can do anything to that degree. And that's just one example. I mean, the immune system is another example. We'll probably have a whole conversation on the immune system and what that means. So the human body, the average human body has about 50 trillion cells in the body, give or take, whatever average is. Every one of those cells has an electrical potential. It's about 0.07 volts per cell. And you say, well, that's, it's a pretty small potential. And I agree, but you do the math, 50 trillion times 0.07 volts of electrical potential. Now you're talking about over 3 billion volts of electrical potential. What would it mean if we could harness that and then apply that to our healing or to our intuition or to the regeneration of the cells in our bodies? But it doesn't stop there, because every cell in our body, it functions as a transistor, it functions as a resistor, it functions as a capacitor, it stores and releases information. It is a photon generator. We're sending light, and light is information. So we're sending light into the field around us, and we're receiving light from the sun and from other individuals. We are photon receivers. Every cell stores information and retrieves it just like we do on a chip. And here, the young people love this. There's a technology out there called blockchain technology that is the foundation for Bitcoin and a lot of digital finance. Where did the idea for blockchain come from? Blockchain technology in computers actually mimics the way that DNA stores information in the cells. The information of the blockchain is immutable. Once it's there forever. It's transparent. If you know how to read it, anybody can read it. It can't be hacked. It is secure. And that's exactly why blockchain is so powerful with digital currencies. That's the way we store information in the human body. And I could go on. The point is, all the technology in the world around us, to some degree, it's mimicking what we already do within our bodies, except we do it better. Can I just share a short story
Absolutely.
about this? 1990, I was hiking through a remote area in northwestern New Mexico, Chaco Canyon, in preparation to lead a group. I was doing a reconnaissance trip. And I was hiking on a remote trail, and there was a native man by himself who was hiking in the opposite direction. And he stopped, and we talked for a few moments. And he began to tell me a story. And the story is pertinent to this conversation. He said, a long time ago, the people of the earth remembered who they were, and they lived much closer to the earth. And they were much happier, of course. And he says, something happened, and even the elders don't know what it was, but the people of the earth began to forget who they are. But they so long for the deep connection that they had between themselves and the forces of nature and the cosmos and the earth under their feet. They so long for that connection that they began to build in the world outside of them reminders of what that connection meant in the world inside of them. And he said, we live in that world today. We long for that connection. We miss ourselves, our true potential. And he said, we'll keep building stuff. We'll clutter our world with gadgets and machines and devices that continue to mimic and reflect back to us who we are, until one day we wake up and we say, oh my God, that's us. And then we will let the external technology go, because we will have remembered to awaken our inner technology. The world becomes more sophisticated because we've awakened, yet it looks simpler because the external clutter goes away. And that man remains a friend today in one of the pueblos in northern New Mexico. But I think his story, and from his perspective, it gives us a deep insight maybe into why we are where we are in the world today. We are reaching this convergence point. We can all feel it. It's like a rubber band. It's just stretched so far. Something's going to give. And in probably many different ways, many things are going to give, because it's unsustainable. But part of that is we're beginning to come back to ourselves and to understand who we are and what our potential really is. And that we are more than the machines that we have built, more than the AI, more than the computer chips. And so this is a decision now that we have to make as a society. Are we willing to give ourselves away to the efficiency and the speed of a computer chip at the expense of losing the power of human emotion, of losing our ability to have empathy and sympathy and compassion for another being? Are we willing to trade those things in for efficiency and speed? And that's a question we have to answer as a society.
And it's a question that the transhumanists would say yes, in order to increase longevity, potentially towards immortality, enhance cognitive capacities, that these things such as human emotion and a lot of these things that we're speaking to are worth giving up, which is a scary thought. I want you to dive, if you will, a little bit deeper into how our DNA is spiritually linked to us.
Sure.
And how these chips and tinkering with the DNA in many ways can lessen our connection to that information pathway to our divinity.
We're at this dangerous place in technology where we know just enough to mess things up. We can edit and hack human DNA. What we don't know, Andre, is we don't know the implications of what we're doing, because science and scientists have yet to fully understand what it means to be human. And one of the places where I think this is coming to light the quickest, and this is how science will learn. Science eventually will have, if science is to remain valid, science has to come to terms with the fact that there is something beyond the human body that is not being accounted for in the scientific models. I'll just say I grew up in northern Missouri, And when I started school, I had the opportunity to see Albert Einstein's brain. When he died, they took his brain from his body and they preserved it in University of Kansas. And they thin sliced it to see what made his brain so different from everyone else, what set him apart from everyone else. And what they found was it looked pretty much like anyone else's brain, with one exception. His brain had way more folds. When you take all those folds and you stretch them out, it means he had more surface area to his brain. And that surface area is more neurons. Neurons, we now know, are essentially biological antennae. We don't store memories in our brains. We don't store memories of our loved ones in the neurons in our brain. The neurons are the antenna that tune to a very specific place, a vibratory space in the field that scientists now know connects all things. 2012, the scientists at CERN, the superconducting supercollider in Geneva, Switzerland, they announced, yes, there is a field that underlies all existence. Esoterically, we had known that and talked about, and everybody said, well, yeah, sure, there's a field. But the scientific community didn't acknowledge that until 2012. That wasn't that long ago. So there's a field. It is a subtle energy field, and information is stored in that field. Our neurons are the antenna that tune to very specific places in that field. DNA does the same thing. So, for example, when we want to learn something new, if you're trying to learn a foreign language, or I'm a musician, you're a musician, we're trying to learn a piece of music, and we're trying to mimic what somebody else does. And the first few times you do it, you go through the motions and it feels awkward, or you're speaking a foreign language and you're saying syllables that just sound weird. All of a sudden, you wake up one morning and, man, you're thinking in Spanish, you're thinking in French. Or all of a sudden, you wake up one morning and you're playing like Steve Vai, my hero, on the guitar. And people say, well, what happened in that time? Well, this is fascinating to me. If you watch the time-lapse photographs of neurons trying to connect, neurons are very social cells. They want to hook up, and they're looking for another neuron to hook up with. That doesn't happen instantly. It takes about 72 hours, about 3 days, for the dendrites to connect and find others. So here's what's actually happening. It is the act of you or me or anyone watching this, to learn something new, to become something more, to better ourselves, to become something more in the next moment than we were in the last moment. That drive, that compulsion that we feel is the trigger. It's the command for the neurons to find other neurons to create the antenna that tunes to the place in the field that holds what we're asking ourselves to master. Does that make sense if I say it that way? It's amazing to see this happen. And this is why a lot of young people today, new generations, their parents will say, man, my kids, they're having a hard time learning because things don't come quickly to them. They want to learn right now. And what I say to them is stay with it and allow the process. Give them 3 days. Ask them to stay with it for 3 days and see if it doesn't get better. And it does, whether you're trying to learn math, science, art, music, a language, whatever it is. So this is important. We need our biology to connect to the information in the field. Divinity is part of that information. Our intuition, our creativity, what some people call your higher self, when you're praying or when you're meditating. What you're actually doing is your physiology, what our ancestors called the temple. This is the temple, the vessel that holds the antenna. We are communicating with that part, that place in the field where many people have come before us and are also communicating with that place in the field. This is why when you begin to replace the natural biology with synthetics, there are no longer neurons. There's no longer DNA. And what that means is there's no longer antenna. So we still may function in this physical world. We have now been veiled. I don't want to say it's completely lost, but the access is veiled, more difficult to get to for our intuition, our conscience that knows what's right and wrong and good and bad, and the ability to communicate with other forms of life on subtle levels, other dimensionalities on subtle levels, the ability to meditate and elevate ourselves in those levels. All of that innovation, creativity, imagination, all of that begins to atrophy. If we don't use, and this is the danger, and the science is showing this, if we don't use those parts of ourselves now, so for example, computer chips are put into the brain, into the neocortex, and they begin to replace mirror neurons. And we'll talk about mirror neurons a little bit. It's a class of neuron. What the studies show really clearly is the new discoveries is that the human brain continues to produce neurons until the last breath we take on this planet. We used to be told, when I was in college, I was told, you've got X number of neurons, and every time you drink a beer, you're going to lose a bunch. So that was the leverage, not to have a beer or whatever it was you were doing. Now we know that's not true. That we continue to produce them until the last breath of life. However, and this is the caveat, if a new neuron is produced and it is not engaged in a meaningful way, within about 14 days, it will atrophy and die because it feels like it's not needed. If we have AI virtual visors in our children that are entertaining them, everything is being done for them. So you got a 3-year-old sitting on the floor in the living room after breakfast with a visor for hours, watching extraordinary scenes and vivid colors and sounds they would never see in the natural world. But here's the thing, it's all being done for them. They're not engaging their imagination. They're not engaging their creativity. They're not engaging their problem-solving skills. All they're doing is being entertained. And what happens is the brain cells that are not engaged begin to atrophy. So now psychologists are publishing papers of young kids that are doing just this, and they have cognitive impairment because everything from motor skills to language to socialization, the visual cortex is thickening because that is the part of their brain that's being used. When we fail to engage our divinity in a meaningful way, those parts of us begin to atrophy in one generation. Next generation, your body says, we didn't use these much. Maybe we don't need this anymore. And it becomes an appendage of a skill that we used to have. This is how you lose a species. It's exactly how you lose a species because it's happening on the genetic level as well, with reproduction, with immune response, all of these kinds of things. So the point is that it's through our natural biology that we have access to our divinity or to our ability to transcend our perceived limitations. When our natural biology is replaced, then those skills either begin to atrophy or we lose access altogether to that field. We're still alive. We may no longer be human if we define human through DNA and as homo sapiens. We may become something very different. One of the directors of research at Google Technology, Ray Kurzweil is his name. He's a futurist. He's a visionary. He's been around for a very long time. And I'm just going to share his perspective, and it's not out of disrespect for Ray Kurzweil because he's a technologist. So he's just looking at the technology and what's possible. And what he says is by the year 2030, 2035, we will no longer be pure human. He said, when you talk to another human, we'll be talking and we will become some degree of hybrid between external technology, artificial technology, and natural biology. And he believes this is moving toward what he calls the singularity. The singularity is where we become the technology that we have embraced within our bodies becomes so dominant that we now are part of the internet of all things, that we are surveilled, we are tracked, our vitals are traced. AI is determining our lifestyles, what we can eat, what we can purchase, how we travel, where we travel, all of that. He says between 2035, 2045 is when he expects what he calls this singularity to occur, where that used to be an interesting scientific concept until political powers began to propose now the policies that are actually implementing these very things. So we've seen this since the year 2019, right before the pandemic, when the World Economic Forum, the unelected officials of the think tank that has been around since 1971, they've always gotten together once a year and, they sit back and talk about what they think the world should be. And I have no problem with that at all. What happened in 2019 is that they signed a formal agreement with the United Nations. And the UN has a program called SDG 2030, Sustainable Development Goals for 2030. 17 goals they want to implement by the year 2030 that they believe make for a better world. These are unelected officials. You and I have no say, and what they're proposing changes every facet of our lives, typically in a way that is about contraction and loss of freedom rather than expansion and the gaining of freedom of expression of life. So the UN has been trying to implement these policies, and they've had a slow start. They're not where they would like to be because they're not popular. The World Economic Forum has had these ideas. They don't know how to give them traction. They signed a formal agreement in 2019 for the UN to use the Sustainable Development Goals as the implementation arm of many of the World Economic Forum ideas because they are so closely aligned. And all of a sudden, those abstract ideas that sound like a dystopian scientific future from a really bad movie are now showing up for votes at the United Nations. They're being proposed to the United States Congress through different forms of legislation, state and federal levels. And I think we need to be aware of these things. It all comes down to this conversation that we're talking about our humanness. Do these ideas, do they give us freedom of imagination, creativity, and expansion of life and health and healing in the body? Or do they want to control, contract, confine, and limit our expression of all of those things? And when we begin to see the answer to that, we can see the thinking and where this is going. But I want to mention may I mention one more thing?
No.
Okay.
I'm just kidding. Go ahead.
Well,
we'll get right back to the show. But first, this episode is sponsored by BetterHelp. How is your social battery right now? Feeling drained? Feeling charged? We all have differing needs for how much time we need to spend alone versus around other people. And I truly feel that the quality of our life is largely dictated by the quality of our relationships. And all relationships with others are directly affected by the relationship we have with ourselves, first and foremost. And so therapy can be a great mirror for your internal landscape and to see where we lack in setting boundaries, maybe have certain coping mechanisms, and ultimately help us clarify who we are, what we value, and which relationships mean the most to us. So if you ever have thought of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your own schedule. Find your social sweet spot with BetterHelp and visit betterhelp.com/knowthyself to get 10% off your first month. Link in the description as well. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/knowthyself. Back to the show.
Here's how science, I think, is going to come to terms with the fact that there's something so much more than we've ever been led to believe, and it's through their attempts to clone life. We've all heard of Dolly, the sheep in the UK that was cloned. The first successful cloning, and for most people, the story stops there. What they don't know is that Dolly, the sheep, at first looked normal and at first looked like any other sheep. She actually conceived and had 6 offspring. But prematurely, her body began to break down, and she died at about 50% of the lifespan of her species. And they thought, well, maybe this is a one-off. Maybe it's a fluke. They've done a lot of experiments, other sheep, and now they're doing this bovine cows as well. Same thing is happening. Their bodies prematurely break down, and they succumb to really strange diseases that are not typical, either for that species or for that age in the species. And they can't figure out why. And they're saying, okay, we took a cell, and now here's another identical cell. Why wouldn't they live the identical life? It's not the identical cell. And this is where I think science is going to have to come to terms with this. So at the risk of too much detail, let me just go into a little bit of detail about how a clone actually works. It's fascinating. Because what they'll do is they'll take the egg from one sheep, for example, and they will remove the DNA in the nucleus and put in the DNA of another sheep into that nucleus and allow it to grow. Here's what they don't tell you. Not all the DNA is in the nucleus. Some of the DNA is outside of the nucleus. And there is a communication that happens between the DNA, an energetic communication that is established. When the term is enucleation, when they take the DNA out of that nucleus, put in another form of DNA into that nucleus, they left the DNA outside of the nucleus. Now, those two realms of DNA are no longer in communication. They can't, and the role that the external nucleus is playing to that internal nucleus of information sharing as a template for longevity, that communication now is lost. So that is at least part of the reason why the premature breakdown is happening. This leads into a realm that the scientific community doesn't want to go there, is that there's more than a chemical conversation going on. It's an energetic conversation. And it's that energetic conversation that gives us our humanness, because our DNA is the antenna. It's a vibratory antenna in communication with a part of us that is ageless, that is timeless. It's the part of us that does all the things that we've been talking about, that allows us to have what some people consider God-like skills, God-like abilities, because they are the kinds of abilities that we've always attributed to our super people, Wonder Woman and Superman and things like that. These the ability to heal on demand, to create resilience on demand, to longevity enzymes, or what some people call anti-aging enzymes on demand. Over 1,300 positive biochemical reactions. We have the ability to self-regulate on demand in a way no other form of life can do. That's part of our divinity. We begin to lose that when we give our humanness away to the technology, to the AI, to the computer chips, chemicals in our blood, gene therapies to enhance immune response. We're just on this edge where we know enough how to implement it. We do not know and have not taken the responsibility to explore ultimately what the implications are. And we're going to have to come to terms with that as a society and as a civilization. And it's going to happen in this generation. It cannot last, another 5 generations. It's right now. This is up for us. And I'm very passionate about this because I believe that we're worth preserving. There is something, and we can get into this deeper, there's something so precious and sacred about our humanness that has never been given to any other form of life that we know of today. Now, there are many forms of life, I'm sure, throughout the cosmos, and maybe it happens somewhere else. But to the best of my knowledge, we're it, and we're all we've got. And if we lose ourselves, if we lose our humanness, we'll never get it back. And the cosmos will never know what it means for us to be fully human on this beautiful planet, this beautiful world we live in. And those that want to steal our humanness have a very different objective and very different ideas. And I think it's important for us to recognize that this is happening in our lives right now, not to be afraid of it by any means, but to be aware and to celebrate our humanness and be aware when policies or people are asking that we allow them to lead us in our lives, elected officials. What do they stand for? And look beyond the things that are being weaponized to divide us. Look beyond those primal, look beyond LGBTQ, and look beyond transhuman, look beyond abortion, look beyond, these, where are they coming from in terms of their humanity? And that, rather than a popularity contest, and that is a very different way of thinking for a lot of people, and I catch heat sometimes for saying that. But if we don't say it now, Andre, we'll never be able to say it. Because within these next few years, either through executive orders or through corporations that are running a lot of what we do and what we eat and how we live, we are going to be pushed into the space where we are being invited or compelled to give our humanness away. And I know it's happening, and I'm still impressed at how sexy the marketing is when I see the marketing and how they appeal to the young people with the images, the videos and things like that. Young people that have never been taught to respect themselves and their bodies and how precious they really are, who wouldn't go for it? Who wouldn't want a computer chip in the brain that allows you to do your gaming without a wire hooked up to your computer, man? Who doesn't want that? So I think our work is cut out for us. And it sounds complex, and for some people it sounds scary, but I think it's very simple. And what it is we make it a point to inform our young people of how special they are, how precious their lives are, to be very aware of what they put into their bodies and what they put onto their bodies, and to help them to understand that their uniqueness is cherished and wanted and needed in the world and can only happen through their natural abilities, not the uniformity of computer chips and AI. So that was a long statement. So what do you think?
It was wonderful. Thank you for just giving all that context and all the nuance and tangents. I think it really helps us understand where we're at with it. I don't think most of us, including probably to many degrees us in this conversation, know to which degree how exponential this technology is evolving, much faster than regulatory agencies would be able to do anything about it. In many degrees, like once the genie is out of the bottle, it's out of the bottle, and we don't know what we don't know. I think we can erroneously attribute malice to where ignorance would suffice. There's that saying, we simply don't know what we're fully doing. Sure. And I've heard you share many times how the more that we truly know who we are, the less we fear the change that is coming. The issue is that so much of us, we don't know who we are. We don't know what the real potential is within human biology, the human spirit. And I love how you reflect on the importance of seeing the stories that we're telling ourselves about what is coming. And so you opened up a lot of avenues and a lot of doors of where we're currently going with this exponential rise of technology, of doing it to a degree where we might not understand the effects that it's having to our human divinity and a lot of these aspects which people would see as superhuman that we have on demand within us. And so I just want you to reflect, if you will, a little bit more about the story that we're telling ourselves about what is coming.
Sure. Let me go back and just pick up a couple of things. And I agree 100%, when you talk about the people developing the technology, and I used Ray Kurzweil as an example. I've worked with a lot of these people. I haven't worked with Ray, but I've worked with people like this. And they're techies, and this is it. And they're in their element. What they've been given is permission to push the boundaries as far as they can, and given the funding and the technology that allows them to open those doors. Now, I have had conversations with them, and I'd say, well, what does this mean for society? What does it mean for a family? What does it mean for a human walking the earth? And here's what they'll tell me. They'll say, don't ask me that question. It's above my pay grade. Say, I'm not paid to think about the social implications. I am paid to push the boundaries of this technology. Somebody else will figure that out. Well, those techies now are running a lot of the policies that we're being asked to embrace with no thought of the social or the moral implications or the lasting implications, without the recognition of just how delicate of a balance our genome really presents to us. And once you tweak that genome in very, very specific ways, which we can now do with, you mentioned it, CRISPR gene editing, you can't unedit. You can, and it's a big process that I don't think you can go back in a species once you make those changes. So yeah, I think a lot of it is the technology. I'll just encapsulate it this way. The technology has developed faster than the morality of how we use it in our lives, or what it means in our lives. And I think it's a very fair statement to say. With your permission, now, can we go into something really deep and esoteric? Are you okay if we do that?
I don't know. It's not really my avenue for this podcast.
All right, well, we don't have to if you don't want to.
I'd love to. Please, let's continue deep diving.
Well, I think one of the reasons, and this isn't new, for generations now, since 1859, Charles Darwin put forth a theory that we call the theory of evolution. In his book, Origin of Species, it was published in 1859. It was a different world in 1859. It was before my time. I certainly don't remember that.
You're timeless, Gregg.
But I've got a really interesting story to tell about, I published a book a few years ago, and I did a radio interview, commuter traffic interview in New York City, to promote this book. And it was all the evidence that does not support evolution. So the interviewer came on in the morning, and man, there was, no good morning, welcome, Gregg. How are you? A 6 a.m. interview for me. It was, commuter traffic in New York. I live in the Mountain States, so it was 8 a.m. for them. And the first thing he says, what gives you the right to talk about evolution and biology? And I said, I thought he was kidding. I said, excuse me? And he says, you're only a geologist. What gives you the right to talk about biology and to question Darwin's theory of evolution? And then I knew he was serious. And I said to him, my brother, do you know what the profession was of the man who developed the theory of evolution? Do you know what Charles Darwin's profession was? And he said, no. And I said, he was a geologist. And he came back, he said, okay, let's go to break. And he took a break and he never came back. So that was the end of that conversation. The point is that Darwin, where I think Darwin made the mistake, was he took what he saw with one form of life, one species of birds, in one location of the Galapagos Islands, in one moment in time, 1853, and he took what he saw happening there and generalized it for all life at all places throughout all time, including humans. So I want to be very clear that as a geologist, evolution is a fact. I've seen it in the fossil record. I have excavated those fossils when I was in school. And I believe in the theory of evolution. It breaks down when it comes to humans. Something happened to us that's not accounted for in our study of evolutionary biology. It happened 200,000 years ago when the first anatomically modern humans is what they're now called. AMH is the acronym, anatomically modern humans. When the first AMH emerged on our planet, we now have the ability to extract the DNA from fossilized remains of ancient forms of life, including forms of life that we used to think were our ancestors. And when you compare their DNA to ours, now we know that we did not descend, for example, from Neanderthal. We may have some Neanderthal DNA. Some people do, especially in Northern Europe, because we shared the earth with them. We walked the earth with them. They say we probably had Neanderthal boyfriends and girlfriends. We interbred. I was a program not long ago, and I made that statement. There was a woman in the front row, and she said, I still do. I still have a Neanderthal boyfriend. And then the guy next to her wasn't laughing at all. So I got to see the whole relationship workshop, happen right before my eyes. But the point is, we did not descend from Neanderthal. We shared the earth with them. If we walked the earth with them, we couldn't have descended from them. And the same is true for these other archaic forms of life. What the DNA is saying, Andre, and this is a mind blower because we don't have to speculate about this piece. When you compare our modern genome, you take your blood or my blood and you compare that to the genome developed from the fossilized remains of our earliest ancestors, we haven't changed. We showed up 200,000 years ago. We don't know where we came from. We haven't changed since then. Now, we have obviously changed in consciousness. We have evolved in the way we think. But our biology has not changed. We had all of the advanced neural network and all of the ability to self-regulate and all the things that our divinity was available to us 200,000 years ago. The way that it happened, scientists now know this, but they don't know what to do with what they have found, is that there were mutations in our DNA that cannot be accounted for under natural circumstances. They don't happen in nature.
With the certain chromosomes?
Yes. For example, one of the most profound is chromosome number 2. Human chromosome 2, it's the second largest chromosome in the human body, in the cell. It has about 1,200 genes in that chromosome. Genes are little segments of the DNA. The chromosome is the long strands of DNA, and then the genes are the shorter segments of the DNA. One of those genes is called TBR number 1. TBR1 is responsible for our brain size. We showed up 200,000 years ago. We got a brain 50% larger than our nearest primate relative. Boom, just like that. It didn't happen slowly, gradually over a long period of time. With a neocortex, I know you've had my brother Joe Dispenza on before, and he talks a lot about neuroscience and the neocortex. The mirror neurons that allow us the ability to envision in our mind an image of what we want to happen in our bodies, and then the mirror neuron feeding the brain and informing the body to produce the chemistry to match what we're seeing in our mirror neurons. That happened 200,000 years ago. Now, some other forms of life have to a lesser extent that, but not like we have. So human chromosome number 2, where did it come from? Well, scientists now know it is the fusion of 2 existing chromosomes. They're fused, on a typical chromosome, and I know a lot of our viewers know this, on the ends of the chromosomes are called telomeres. You hear about this a lot in
longevity space,
biohacking and longevity. Telomeres at the ends of the chromosomes that protect the DNA inside. If this is a chromosome, then on the ends of the chromosome are the telomeres that protect the vital DNA information in here, because when the cell divides and the chromosomes split, that's a trauma to that chromosome, and part of the chromosome does not make the split. You don't want that to be the good stuff in here, so nature gives us this buffer on the ends called the telomeres. When the split happens, the part that doesn't make it is not that vital because it's on the ends. Well, here's chromosome number 2. What we see is there's telomeres on the ends of the chromosome, and there's telomeres right in the middle, because it was originally 2 separate chromosomes that were fused. So now you've got telomeres where they should never be, in the middle of the chromosome. That doesn't happen in nature. But it didn't stop there, because once that fusion happened, there was redundancy in the functions of the chromosomes. So some of the chromosomes were turned off, some of them were silenced, some of them were moved, some were added to stabilize this. This can't happen in nature. We didn't know what that meant until gene editing occurred, and it appears that a gene editing happened 200,000 years ago. And if it was only chromosome 2, you could say maybe it's a fluke, but it's not. Our ability as a musician, I've always had the question, we share 98% of our DNA with a chimp, for example, 98%. But chimps can't sing. You know, I've always wondered, I mean, you're never going to hear a chimp sing Led Zeppelin's Stairway to Heaven. And if you do, let me know.
It definitely will.
Yeah. No, it can't happen. And here's the reason. Because chromosome 7, when you look at primates for about 175 million years, I think that number is accurate, chromosome 7 was stable. No changes. 175 million years. All of a sudden, there was this little tweak of 2 genes that were switched around. And when that switch happened, it gave us the ability, it connected our tongue and our brain and our mouth in a way that gave us the ability to have complex speech and to sing. Guess when it happened? Just
200,000 years
exactly
ago.
200,000 years ago. And there are other things that happened as well. These things, they didn't happen slowly, gradually over a long period of time, and they typically don't happen in nature. So we begin to see that the odds of this occurring are so small that scientists say it appears that there's been an intervention. That's the word that they use. They don't say who or what, but there's been some kind of an intervention. And this leads to the deep esoteric conversation that I'd like to have, if you're okay if we do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I love, because the precision, the timing of this, as you're speaking to, points to something beyond the standard evolutionary model. And I love that Fred Hoyle quote that you gave, that I heard you share as an astrophysicist.
British astrophysicist, yeah.
Yeah, about a tornado.
He said the odds, when he was asked at a conference, he was going through all the math, and somebody in the audience said, you know, cut the math. What are the odds? And he said, let me put it this way. He said the odds of human DNA forming the way that it formed to make us who we are today are the odds of a tornado sweeping through a junkyard and on the way out leaving a Boeing 747 behind. And we all know that's probably not going to happen. So that was his way of saying, and this is, you know, the scientific community, this is why they're stuck. Because there's a huge difference, Andre, between revealing new discoveries and new information and forcing those new discoveries to fit into a pre-existing model. There's a huge difference between doing that and revealing new information and allowing the information to lead to the story that it tells. There's a reluctance in the scientific community traditionally to do the latter. Where the information, and I'm going to go into this a little bit more deeply, where that information is leading takes the scientific community to a place that they are traditionally not equipped to deal with, and so they prefer to avoid it. They're not bad people. I have friends in academia, and I've asked them the question. They say, why can't you teach this to your students? And they're the age I am. I'm 70. So they've been teaching, 40, 45 years. And what they say is, we're going to let the next generation of professors deal with this problem. We would have to change all of our class notes. It makes us look wrong as professionals to have to go back and change the story. And I tell them, I said, no, it actually validates the power of science because it shows that science is so relevant. It's made to be updated as new information comes to light. It's a living story. It's not a static story. So for me, once I began to understand on a personal level that the mutations that give us our humanness cannot happen in nature. Of course, that begs the question, how did it happen? What a lot of people don't know, my degree's in geology. I have studied, and I'm an amateur archaeologist. I don't have an advanced degree in archaeology, but I've done a lot of archaeological work. I'm a scholar. I've done a lot of historic work, ancient text, ancient traditions, traveled to the places where the people still live that preserve many of these traditions. And all of that led me to the question, if we are the product of an intentional act that occurred 200,000 years ago, where would we find the evidence of that act? Would it be left on a temple wall in Peru that could crumble after a few thousand years? Would it be in the Middle East on a scroll that could be burned or hidden or, destroyed in some way? And then I began to look at my artist friends. And every one of my artist friends does the same thing. When they create something they're proud of, the last thing they do is they sign it. They put their name on it. And I said, if we are the product of an intentional act, it makes sense that who or what is responsible for us would have left a signature. Where would we find that? And I was asking this question in the 80s and the 90s. We didn't have the internet. Early 90s, we started having the internet. Didn't have computers like we do now. So a lot of what happened was by hand. My sense was it would be in the DNA of all life. And you say, well, how could a message be written in the sticky, gooey stuff inside of a cell? Because that's the way we're taught to think about DNA. Well, this is a big story, and I'm not sure even where to jump in. But let me say this. In 2007, Japanese scientists released a report showing that they had stored written information into the DNA of a bacteria. And they chose this bacteria because it replicates quickly, so they could look at hundreds of generations of bacteria and then take that 100th generation, pull the DNA out, and the information was still there. They proved that DNA is a very efficient information storage medium. That was in 2007. The question I had been asking is, did this happen to us a long time ago? And the way it took me 20 years of original research to have the answer that satisfied me, it became a book in 2004 called The God Code, was the name of the book. And the bottom line is this: if you take the chemical codes that make the DNA in our bodies, they're made from elements that you find on the periodic table, and every one of those elements has different ways to represent it. It's got mathematic representations like valence number and atomic weight and atomic mass. Those are all different numbers that represent the same element. Hydrogen, for example. And I began looking at that periodic table and wondering if that somehow would correlate to the ancient languages that have been left for us that tell us who we are. So now shift gears just briefly. There are 4 root or core alphabets that all alphabets are derived from, thought to in one way or another. There are originally 6. 2 of them have been lost. The 4 that remain are ancient cuneiform, ancient Sanskrit, Arabic, that's still used today, and Hebrew, that's still used today. Those are the 4 root languages. One of the great mysteries of linguistics, I'm an amateur linguist, is that every one of the ancient languages has always had numbers that represent the letters. And the science of interchanging those numbers is called gematria. And I want to just make a distinction. This isn't numerology. Numerology is a loose derivative that doesn't follow the rules of gematria. There are 32 rabbinical rules that were laid down in the 2nd century Common Era, CE, AD. They use CE now, Common Era, rather than before and after the death of Jesus. 32 rabbinical rules. And for gematria to be valid, you've got to follow those rules. So I said, if the DNA of our bodies holds a language, is it possible that the numbers could be the common link that would allow us to go from chemicals to letters? In other words, is it possible, can I read the DNA in my body like I read the letters on the page of a book? And the answer is yes. It took 20 years to figure that out. And the information in our DNA is in layers, and each layer has a different code. The first layer is considered as the introduction, just like you would have an introduction into the page of a book. So now what we're doing, Andre, is we're putting on an IT hat. And rather than looking at biology 101, where you have a cell, and in the cell you have a chromosome, and the chromosomes are made of genes, now we're looking at the cell as a library. What if the cell is a library? And every chromosome is a book, and the genes are the paragraphs and the sentences in that book. And that's exactly what's happened. It's a very different way of thinking. And I caught a lot of heat for it in the scientific community. Once I started talking about this, I lost credibility in some circles. And that's okay, because it's by crossing the traditional boundaries that have separated our way of knowing in the past that we gain new wisdom that leads us beyond the boxes. And so I wanted to go beyond the boxes. So what I did by hand initially was I went through and took all the elements in our DNA. It's primarily hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, carbon. This is what we are, different amounts: hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, carbon. I looked at all the numbers that represent those and made a list. About that time, computers became popular, and the human genome was now available on a computer. So I could actually take DNA and look at it, what I'm actually dealing with here. At the same time, I went back into the ancient languages, and I looked for a number of the elements that would match the numbers of the ancient language. So I'm looking at the periodic table, correlating it to gematria. And there's only one number that works. It took 20 years to figure it out. And that is atomic mass. The atomic mass of the elements of our DNA correlates to the letters of the ancient alphabets. And here's the beautiful thing, is the message that it reveals is exactly the same in all four. It's the same in Arabic, the same in Hebrew, the same in cuneiform, and the same in Sanskrit, and probably other languages. But those are the four core languages. So when we make that substitution, when you use that numeric link, and literally into the DNA bases, cytosine, thymine, guanine, adenine, when you go into those bases and you make those substitutions, it actually spells out the answer to probably the oldest question that we've ever asked. When we say, who are we? The translation of the first layer in the DNA, the introduction of every cell in our body, reads exactly the same. And it literally, this isn't a metaphor, it literally reads the words, God eternal within the body. God eternal within the body. And the name of God that's written in our DNA is exactly the same as it's written in the oldest spiritual and religious, our most ancient and cherished spiritual traditions. That name is actually written into the DNA of our bodies. So what we can say with absolute certainty is when we forget who we are, when we think our differences are so great that separate us through the attempt to isolate us and break the social bonds, and we no longer know who we are, we need look no further than 50 trillion cells in the human body, and the first layer of every one of those cells that literally says God eternal within the body. It doesn't say who God is, where God came from. And people have said to me, the rabbis came down really hard on me and said, we've tried to keep this secret. What gives you the right to reveal it? And I said, because I'm not a rabbi. And I said, if we were ever going to reveal this to ourselves, what better time than now, when we're on the verge of destroying the very essence of the humanists that we love and cherish. We're on the brink of war. This was in the 80s and 90s, right at the end of the Cold War, another war we were on the brink of. What better time to reveal this than now? And why wouldn't we want to tell ourselves that we are God eternal within the body? We're not some random process, the result of a random mutation, slow, gradual evolution. There's an intentional intervention and a signature to tell us about that intervention that literally says we are God eternal within the body. What does that mean? What does it mean to live your life as God eternal within the body? And what I've found is when people discover this, I see this in live audiences. I watch people's eyes and I can feel the vibe in the room, because now everyone has a challenge in their lives. How does God eternal within the body deal with this disease? How does God eternal within the body deal with the betrayal of the trust? And it's very different than how we're taught to think of it as mere mortal humans, is what somebody said to me once. So that message is only possible because 200,000 years ago, who or whatever intervened to give us our humanness, left a message to tell us. And it's only now, when we arguably are on the brink of global war, this is the year 2024 in the spring, when the technology is being developed so quickly and we're being encouraged to give away our humans and literally replace our bodies with artificial substances and chips and AI and gene therapies, only now that same technology comes full circle and says, this is who you are. Maybe it wouldn't have meant the same thing if we'd discovered it 50 years ago. Now when you go back and you look at our most ancient and cherished traditions, they've always said to us that our body is the temple, that we are a temple. And this gives new meaning to the temple, because inside of a temple typically is something precious and sacred. And within us is a message from who or whatever is responsible for us being here, telling us that we are God eternal within the body. And I think our greatest mastery, what we're being asked to do, is to preserve the temple that holds the message, to not destroy the temple, to not relinquish it, to become a hybrid being where that message has little or no meaning any longer. I don't know if that makes sense or not. I don't talk about this a lot in interviews, but I think this is where we are as a species right now.
Thank you for sharing. I think it's a really important avenue to continue opening up, because just to kind of recap where we're at, when we spoke to this event that happened 200,000 years ago, that we're not sure of what happened, but it's 1 in 10 to the power of 600, I believe I heard you share, where
Can I clarify this?
Yeah.
What scientists say is that when the odds of something are occurring are 1 in 10 to the 400th power, it's impossible. To have the genetic arrangement that we have, they say, is 1 in 10 to the 600th. If 1 in 10 to the 400 is impossible, 1 in 10 to the 600 means it's more than impossible that this is a fluke of nature or that it is a lucky accident. There's an intentionality. 0.00042% is the odds of this happening purely by chance. So we can say that there is some, as a scientist, I have to say this, and I realize I'm crossing a lot of traditional boundaries to do this. I have to say there's been an intervention. Now, where this gets really interesting is, as an amateur archaeologist, every culture that I've ever studied, now I have not studied every ancient culture, but every single one, not one of our indigenous ancestors says that we're the product of long, slow, gradual mutations over a long period of time. Everyone from, I've led groups into the highlands of central China and Tibet, 12 monasteries, 2 nunneries over 26 days. We did that until they closed the borders. The Bedouins in Egypt, the Sadhus in Nepal, the Quechua,
Aboriginals.
In Peru, the Aboriginals, all through the American Desert Southwest, everyone has a creation story that says we are the product of an intervention, that we are much more. We're not what we've been told. We're so much more than we've been led to believe, and that we are part of a global family. We have a global family awaiting for us when we reach the point where we accept our humanness, when we embrace the deep truth of what it means to be human. That's the gateway to the reunion with a greater family. This is interesting because we now know that in recent times, within the last couple of years, there's a disclosure process that's trying to happen on a governmental level between us. Disclosure means something that it means to CNN, or Fox News or MSNBC. The reluctance to come forward with the evidence that is being presented. I think one of the reasons for that is because once it is actually admitted, what we all suspect, that we have that communication, that we have technology from beyond this world, it opens the door to our origin and to the truth of our origin and to the power of our divinity, which is counter to the narrative. Divinity is about expansion and freedom and localized living of health and healing. What's being pushed on us right now is centralization, control, contraction. And you don't hear so much in mainstream about taking care of the body. It's here, take this to fix the body that you've broken by living the life that we've given you, eating the food that we've given you, or what they call food. So it's a very, very different narrative. So everything we're talking about even goes down to what's happening with disclosure. And it's all part of, once that happens, that speaks to our divinity. That speaks to the battle between good and evil. That speaks to the freedom of our humanness. So it's not separate from, I think it's a big part of it. And that's why there's so much resistance to it right now, in my opinion, in one man's opinion.
Yeah. So, of course, we're exploring things here that we're not, we're examining some various different possibilities at something that is apparently beyond impossible to have occurred 200,000 years ago. But somehow there's consilience around all of these ancient sites and civilizations, back to ancient Sumerians, to the Egyptians, that have similarities in their creation story, even going to the book of the Sefer Yetzirah, the book of creation, that gives this ancient Hebrew text that shares a kind of eyewitness moment of what happened for that moment of creation, with the understanding that these are all possibilities. What do you feel like could have happened actually 200,000 years ago? What kind of intervention possibly would have occurred? There's these depictions of these beings with elongated skulls. There's these various stories from different ancient wisdom traditions that say various different things, but there all are a lot of similarities. And so what do you, to the best of your ability and knowledge, feel like could have actually happened?
Well, from a scientific perspective, I believe that a form of gene editing happened where we were infused. You go back to chromosome number 2, what I didn't say, because it wasn't part of the topic in the moment, chromosome number 2 is the fusion of 2 pre-existing chromosomes that were in primates here on Earth at that time. They weren't humans. So 200,000 years ago, it appears that the most evolved species on Earth was selected and infused with genetic material from a higher, more evolved species that we call gods, and we are the product of that. We have the muscle strength, and we have the bodies, the physicality, and the sexuality of the forms of life that were here on Earth infused with the DNA. And now bear in mind, the DNA is the antenna. So we are attuned to information and a way of knowing and a way of being that's more than what was ever available and cannot be to those other primates, because their DNA antenna is different. They're tuned in to something very, very different. So we are a hybrid of what our ancestors called human and God, or animal and God, and the product is human. Human is this hybrid. And depending on which text you want to go to, they are, just full of the stories about how this happened from different perspectives, whether you call them the angels from the heavens or the gods from the heavens, and all kinds of stories about that. But they're very clear. And these are the books in the 4th century, the books that were left out of the Christian canon, are called Apocrypha. And these are the books like the Book of Enoch is, for example. Red Wheel Weiser is a publisher that has re-released the Book of Enoch, and they asked me to write the foreword for the new release, and I did that. And the Book of Enoch, it's not an easy read. It's not a long book, but it is a story from the prophet Enoch of exactly what we're talking about, of the angels in the heavens who came to observe and protect, actually were enamored and fell in love with humans. And that was the fall. That was the descent. That was the fall from heaven, and began to procreate with them. And we are the product of that. So when we look at the big picture of light and dark, good and evil, I mean, it just goes so deep into all of this. But that is playing out, I think, in our lives right now. I think whether I had the opportunity in the 1990s, before he died, I toured with Zecharia Sitchin. And he wrote the Chronicles, the Earth Chronicles books. And he talked about this extensively. And I want to be really clear. I think he was an amazing scholar. I don't agree with all of his interpretation from the cuneiform text. He believed that we were created to be a slave species, to do the work, the mining of elements on this planet that were needed by another race. We may have been enslaved at some point in our past. I don't think that's the reason that we're created. This is a very important distinction. I don't think that's why we are as we are. It may have happened to us by those, we may have been enslaved by those who have had power over us. And there are stories about how that happened and when that happened. But this is a fundamental difference between Sitchin and I, is he thought that was the purpose of our existence, and I don't see the evidence for that at all. I think we are so much more than that, and it's a whole deep conversation about why we're created and who we are and what this creation really is all about. But the bottom line for me is that we now have the science that tells us that we are more than lucky biology.
Yeah.
And I think that's important. And now we know there's literally information coded into the DNA of our bodies. You know, what the scientific papers are now saying, once Japanese scientists proved this, 2007, now what they're saying is that DNA is a denser storage medium than flash drive, that it takes no energy to hold the information once it's imbued into the DNA. And as long as one example of that life continues to live, that message remains for thousands of years, millions of years. They're now storing the Library of Congress in the United States into bacteria that is radiation resistant. In the event we ever, God forbid, have a nuclear war and all of our information is wiped out, if the bacteria survives, and if we have one computer that is preserved that can pull it out, we can start over again. I mean, this is how deep this information, how deep this goes.
So I've heard you share about these 5,125 year cycles, and 5 of them would be equated to the precession of the equinox, and
Yeah.
how humanity might be in this cyclical time, not linear time. Can you share about that?
I can, and I'm happy to, but I think the new discoveries are showing something even deeper than that. And I'll just mention it. If you want to go there, we can. I think beyond any reasonable doubt, what the physics is showing is that we are in a virtual reality. We're in a simulated experience. Or Stephen Hawking, before he died, this was his last quest. He wanted to know if we are living in what he called a base reality. Is this the reality, or are we a spinoff of a base reality that's happening somewhere else? As Nick Bostrom, 2001, put together the first algorithm, plugged in a lot of variables, and to determine what are the odds that this is a virtual reality. And the bottom line is the odds are much greater than not that we are living in a simulated reality. Our physics actually makes more sense. There's not much to us. We're pretty much, when I say we're empty beings, I don't mean that from a spiritual perspective, but when you look at an atom is mostly empty space. And that's what we are, a lot of empty space in those atoms. One of the amazing experiments that was done early in the 20th century was called the double slit experiment. I know many of our viewers are probably familiar with this. What they found was that a particle will behave differently when it's being observed and when it's not being observed. If it's not being observed, it is a wave of energy. When it's being observed, it collapses into a particle of reality. In the simulation theory, this is fascinating, Andre, because as a computer scientist, I know this. When you're building a big simulation, it takes so much memory in the computer to hold the entire simulation present when you're not using all the simulation. So what happens, if you got a computer game, when your avatar opens the door to a room, it's only when they open the door to that room that the room appears, because it would take so much memory to always have that room sitting there if nobody's using it. That appears to be the way our world works. This is what the double slit experiment was showing. If nobody is looking, it's pure energy.
And also just the Nobel Prize recently for local realism being proof false.
Exactly, yeah, the Nobel Prize for this. And now, the whole point of the simulation theory, and what's important for me and where it ties into the indigenous traditions that you're talking about, as a former computer scientist, I'm not actively doing it now. My job was pattern recognition software as a senior computer systems designer during the Cold War years. And one of the amazing things that we found in terms of simulations is that they run on cycles. So you have a simulation, and then what's happening in the simulation are sub-programs that are running these cycles that reset themselves to keep the simulation going. It was about the time of the end of the Cold War in the early 90s when the concept of fractal mathematics, and the Mandelbrot set was an example of the fractal mathematics, really came into vogue. And the interesting thing, if you bring up one of those you can go on, you can Google it and it'll bring up a little model where it just keeps zooming in forever and ever and ever into the fractal. The way that works is that there is a very simple formula that is set up where the answer becomes the input for the next iteration. And all you do is you bump up maybe one, you increment by one, feed that back into the equation, and now that's giving you a new image, and you're doing it through a computer. It keeps things going. We appear to be living in something like that. We know that nature, as complex as it looks, is actually very simple. And it's based on just a few fundamental patterns that our ancestors called the Platonic solids, for example. And all of nature is based on those Platonic solids. And the We know that our world is holographic, that the whole is reflected in every piece. We know that it is entangled. There was a Nobel Prize for entanglement that was just awarded a couple of years ago. And we know that it is fractal. And what that means is there's just a few patterns that are feeding into this equation, this iterative equation, on different scales. So, for example, you look at an atom. An atom, the old model of an atom was there's a nucleus and some electrons moving around that looks a whole lot like a solar system with a sun and some planets moving around. It looks a whole lot like a galaxy with a black hole and or universe and galaxies moving around it. It's the same pattern, just different scale. And this is the way a simulation will work. This is the way our world would work. What our ancestors told us is every once in a while, we go through what we would call a reset. And I think that was the 2012 phenomenon, was identifying that in the Mayan calendar. What makes this really interesting, a lot of people don't know this, is 2012 was not the reset. 2012 marked the end of a cosmic relationship, an alignment with the ecliptic of our solar system and the sun and the Milky Way. But you don't stop a cycle on a dime. You don't stop it at noon, on December 21st. There's a buffer, a window where you phase from one to another. And there's a mathematical formula that tells you how long that window is. For 2012, it's a 36-year-long window, 18 years before 2012, 18 years after. 2030 is the end of that 2012 cycle. It's when we actually move into a new world. Now, the Mayans told us, they said, you're not going to recognize your world. You won't recognize yourself. You won't recognize your land any longer. And everybody said, ha, 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 And now it's hard to recognize our world. Our boundaries are changing. Our borders are changing. Our nations are changing. And we're changing. And 2030 happens to be the year that the UN has targeted for come hell or high water. They want those sustainable development goals in that year. Why that year? Why not 2035, or not, why not 2028 or 2029? They're on, and World Economic Forum is targeted 2030. And so many people are looking at 2030 as something is incoming in the year 2030. And the powers that be are jockeying for position of control and power before that something occurs. And I think the Mayan calendar is giving us insight into what that is that we can expect, as well as the Hindu traditions. We're definitely in the Kali Yuga and different phases of the Kali Yuga. I was with some of the Native North American traditions as well. The Hopi prophecy rock shows us we have had two great shakings in our past. They call the First and Second World War. There's a point on their petroglyph timeline that we have now passed, and in front of us lies a third great shaking. And when I have asked the elders in the past, I said, what does that mean? What is the shaking? Does that mean a war? And they said, we don't know. They said, it's a shift, but we don't know for sure what that will mean. When I'm in the Yucatan and I talk to the Mayan elders and we look at the Mayan calendar, it shows 4 worlds before ours, 5,000-year cycles. And then the 5th world is that face right in the center. Each of those 4 worlds has a petroglyph that describes how that world ended. So there was a world that ended in wind, and one that ended in fire, one that ended in ice, and one that ended in a flood. And I say, okay, the petroglyph in the middle, that face, how's this world end? And they said, that is the petroglyph for movement. And I said, what does that mean? And they said, we don't know. I said, are you talking about, like, does the earth move, or is there a shift in the land? They said it could be a movement of consciousness. It could be a movement of people, a migration. It could be a movement of the earth. We don't know. We just know that that is the petroglyph for movement. They're very honest. about that. So those traditions, they're all pointing to sometime in our very near future as being some kind of an energetic reset. And this is part of the bigger conversation. If we are in a simulation, it makes sense that every once in a while we would go through some kind of a reset. Not the end, just a change. And I think what we're all learning is by being the best version of ourselves, by accessing our divinity, celebrating our divinity, our imagination, our creativity. I use this word a lot, the deep truth of what it means to be human. Our healing, our love, our forgiveness, all of those qualities. By doing that, we are prepared for that reset whenever it happens, rather than being afraid of the reset and trying to defend against or some way. There are scientists now that believe they can stop the reset. They want to change. There are proposals right now, because we have the technology. They want to change the orbit of our planet to shift our relationship to the sun and the center of the Milky Way so that we shift our relationship to time. In my opinion, there's some things we shouldn't mess with. Okay, the human genome is one of those, and the orbit of Earth in space.
That's wild.
It is wild, but it's an example. It's insane, Andre. It's like kids playing with toys. They unlock just enough of the mystery to be able to tweak that mystery without thinking it through, without thinking through what are the consequences. Is this a responsible thing to do? Is it a moral thing to do? Do we have the right to do this? And this is where I come to blows with some of my scientific friends, because I believe that there is a moral imperative to preserve our humanness and to preserve the planet. To preserve the planet just because we can doesn't mean we should.
So the simulation conversation is very revealing into the ephemeral nature that is our reality, and I think is very interesting. And also, like we just kind of briefly mentioned, how these, through the Pleistocene geological era, the comet strike and the end of civilizations that have occurred previously, the consilience between Sumerians, ancient Egypt, a lot of these point towards this mother civilization, and civilizations that had much more advanced technology than many people in the modern academia world right now would like to explore. But I think it's really important because in many ways, if time and this kind of humanities and this cyclical flow, what is coming is also what we've experienced in the past in these ancient civilizations. And so I just want to reflect a little bit more on these ancient technologies and civilizations that could have existed that also point to what occurred a couple 100,000 years ago. And so what do you see as a strong possibility for these ancient mother civilizations?
Earth is not what we've been told, and our past is not what we've been told, and we are more than we've been led to believe. And I think all that's being revealed right now. And I think some of the most revealing evidence is not even on Earth, it's on the moon. And the moon itself. There's a growing body of evidence that suggests that the moon is an artificial body, that it was engineered. I just did a video on this recently, an interview. And I mean, it's fascinating. One of the things, it's so deep, I'm not even sure where to begin here. One of the first things that scientists noticed is, and we all know, the moon is covered in meteorites. Big ones, small ones, overlapping ones, but they will not go below a certain depth. They're hitting something that doesn't allow them to go below a certain depth. In the 60s, and then again in the 90s, scientists did things that they weren't really supposed to do on the moon. One of those is that they sent a missile in the 90s to the moon, to a crater, a very specific crater in the moon. There's a lot of controversy around what happened. But when that missile hit, the seismic recorders picked up that the moon was ringing like a bell for hours. which is not what a solid planet would do. And the reports have been declassified through Freedom of Information. You can find them on the internet. The samples that the astronauts brought back. I had the opportunity to tour with Ed Mitchell in the 90s as well before he passed. He was the founder of the Institute of Noetic Sciences, sixth man to walk on the moon. And we did go to the moon, and he did walk on the moon. I'm not sure we went at exactly the very first time, exactly the way we said, but we definitely have been to the moon. One of the things that they found when they brought the soil samples back is that there are materials in those samples that are not formed in nature. They're artificial materials, metals that do not form in nature. And there they are in the soil. The orbit of the moon is anomalous to any other moon to its planet in our solar system in the sense that it is offset just enough to create the tidal motion of the oceans that holds the Earth relatively stable. And there are indigenous traditions, Andre, this is fascinating, that I don't know how deep you want to go into all this, but they talk about the time.
As deep as possible.
Well, there are writings. There are writings out there before they talk about the time before the moon existed. And before the moon existed, the tides were horrendous. They were 400-foot tides that would come and wash over the land, and they do it on a rhythmic basis, and it was a very unstable environment. The moon is what stabilized that, but it can only happen. Other moons are aligned with the equators of their planets. Our moon is not aligned with our equator. It's the only one that's not. It is offset at just the right angle to stabilize the ocean. What are the odds of that happening, just by chance? The number of lunar circumferences between the Earth and the moon, I didn't know we were going to talk about this. I don't have the numbers exact right now, but there's a very specific, it's a geometric ratio of how many moons fit between the Earth and the moon and the sun.
I think it's 108.
I'm thinking it's 108 because it's tied into the Buddhist traditions, and that's 108 is the beads on the mala. And it just goes on and on. There's so many factors that strongly suggest that the moon is engineered, and as well as the two moons of Mars, Deimos and Phobos, which are smaller and not spherical, but they also appear to be hollow and engineered. Who was around engineering moons, and how long ago could that have happened? And I think all of this, when we look at as a geologist, okay, I didn't know we were going to talk about this, so we'll just do a deep dive here. And I'll start at the center of the galaxy. Every once in a while, there is a burst of what's called a volley of cosmic energy that comes from the center of the Milky Way, cosmic rays, through the solar system, through the galaxy, including our solar system. Cosmic rays are usually no big deal. Like, we're getting cosmic rays right now. And because there's so much space in our atoms, those cosmic rays, they pass right through us. No big deal. Like, we're getting them right now. Everybody is. The center of our planet is so dense from the pressure of the planet, and it is so hot, that when those cosmic ray volleys, when they hit the center of the Earth, they can't pass through. And what they do is they end up heating up the core. It's called perturbance. And the core actually heats and it shifts its location. So when you look at the cross-section of the Earth, here's the core of the Earth, which is believed to be iron and nickel, solid iron-nickel core. Now, recently, just within the last few months, geologists believe that there's a core inside of that made of something even denser. They don't know what it is. So right now, the core of the Earth, it's dense iron nickel. That's the inner core. The outer core is a molten core, and the inner core kind of floats in that outer core. And then beyond that, we have the mantle. It's about 1,800 miles thick. And then beyond that, we have the crust that we live on. It's only about 36 miles thick. The average depth of the crust is about 36 miles. So when those cosmic ray volleys come in, they can't pass through the core. What they do is they heat it up, and it begins to change its rotation. And where it is in the molten outer core, those ripples, those perturbations are then translated into the mantle, and the mantle begins to upwell into the crust in places where it hasn't in the past, usually along fault lines where it's thin, the crust is thin, and where it's weak. So scientists now have, and I've got images of these, you can see there are what are called mantle plumes, where the mantle is leaking this molten stuff. And there's one big plume in the Pacific and one right under the Middle East, underneath Turkey and Pakistan, and where the big earthquakes have happened, and one right under in the Pacific where the earthquakes are happening right now as well. So here's where this gets interesting. That cosmic ray volley happens about every 26,000 years. And it takes about 26,000 years for the cosmic rays to travel from the center of our Milky Way to reach our planet. 2012 was actually talking about the cosmic ray volley coming into the Earth. When this happens, it heats the Earth from the inside, and this causes the climate change. It's very controversial. Humans are not causing the climate change. We're contributing. We have to, because we're kicking stuff into the atmosphere. But here's the thing. The oceans are producing the CO2 that scientists are measuring. And let me just give you some ideas. About 330 gigatons per year come from the ocean. About 43 gigatons come from us and our cars. I mean, you can see the magnitude. And the oceans are actually warming from underneath. If it were human-caused CO2, the atmosphere would be warming the oceans from the top down. That's not what's happening. The glaciers are melting. Greenland's melting from underneath. Antarctica's melting from underneath. The scientists that know this, it's been politicized, and it's hard to talk about it. Rather than creating a war against climate change that we didn't cause, in my opinion, what we need to do is fortify. And there are things that we can do to mitigate that climate change. We can bury our power grids, for example, so they're not susceptible to the cold or the hurricanes or whatever it is that's happening. But this is something that we can expect over these next few years. More earthquakes, and that we've seen more earthquakes magnitude 6 and above in the last 20 years at these plate junctions. So in the Middle East, it's a triple plate junction, 3 plates coming together right underneath Turkey, 7.8 magnitude. Then they had one in Pakistan. I think it was 2019 or 2020. It was 7.6 or something like that. And it's almost, once it happens on one side, like in the Pacific, you'll see it happen on the other side as well. So the good news, we're in California right now, and we're on one of those plate junctions. The good news in California is that underneath the way our plates are coming together, you typically don't get a big earthquake. What you get is a continuous low rumble. You can't tell where one stops, another one starts, but they're all magnitude 1 to 2, maybe 3. So there's a constant steady release of energy, which is good, rather than everything being quiet and building up and all of a sudden, boom, you don't want that. Yep. So we know that this happens about every 12,000 years. 12,000 years ago, it creates a lot of volcanic activity. And every 12,000 years, we have what is called a supervolcano. We've got one that happened 12,000 years ago. We've got one that happened 24,000 years ago. You can go back and see. And it's that supervolcano that kicks up the sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere that actually brings about the cooling that we are going into now. Earth is actually going into a cooling. And you notice they are not calling it global warming anymore. They dropped that term because they know we're cooling. They're just calling it climate change. So we've seen a history of this. This ties into what you're talking about. Ancient civilizations rise and fall and have been obliterated during the times that we've gone through these big shifts. Some of them we're now finding them underneath massive mudslides, for example. There are satellite images showing on the west coast of the United States the river flows from the Rockies out into the Pacific, for example. And underneath that, these massive mud flows, they're finding archaeological remnants of advanced civilizations that people want to talk about. Antarctica is an example. The ice covering Antarctica right now, when the Earth was warming, the ice was melting, allowing satellite penetration into the ice. And what they found, and these weren't like primitive huts, these are massive, complex archaeological structures. If you go to Google Earth right now, there's a big part of Antarctica that's pixelated out. They won't let you see it. I have images before they pixelated it. And you can see in archaeology, when you see a 90-degree angle, nature doesn't carve 90-degree angles. So wind, it's called aeolian erosion, fluvial erosion, water erosion. They never happen in 90-degree angles. And what you see are massive 90-degree angles, huge complexes underneath the ice, and some of them sticking up out of the ice, big walls, as well as four-sided pyramids, 2 kilometers by 2 kilometers by 2 kilometers by 2 kilometers, massive structures down there. And the ice has been there 20,000 years. So you say, well, either someone, as a scientist, you have to say this, either someone built in the ice or those structures were there before the ice occurred. And that ice happened at 2 cycles ago, 12,000-year cycles ago. So we are 12,000 to 13,000 is half of one of those cosmic ray volleys. So you get the incoming, the lesser of the volley, and then you get the full volley. So when we look at the history of the Earth, what we are conditioned to do, we go back 5,000 years, and we're saying civilization began 5,000 years ago. That's the most recent cycle of civilization. And you can actually plot these out I've done this, plot these out on a graph, and you see the Incan and the Aztec and the Maya and, Rome and Greece and Egypt and Samaria is where we say it began about 5,000 years ago. And we're taught that's the history of the world. What's the history of that 5,000-year cycle? Now, you go back and you look at the new discoveries, Göbekli Tepe, 13,000 plus years before present. The Great Sphinx in Egypt is now being dated around 9 to 12,000 BP before present. Certainly the pyramid, the watermarks on the pyramid are showing the erosion from when the ice melted. It means the pyramids were there when the ice melted, 12,000 years ago. So there's a whole story that's beginning to unfold that it goes back, I think, so much further than we've been led to believe. Now you look at the texts. You look at the King's List, for example, in ancient Sumeria. And what you see, it's really interesting. Andre, are you familiar with the King's?
I'm not.
It's an archaeological remnant. It's a stela, beautiful stela. It is in cuneiform, and it lists the kings that have ruled, and some of them were ruling for periods of thousands of years. And then it lists the Great Flood, clearly, and then the rulers after began to rule only in terms of decades or multiple decades. Now, the interesting thing about the King's List is that from the time of the flood forward, every one of those rulers, their names, the length of time that they ruled is right on. It's absolutely accurate. The times before that, archaeologists say, well, that's a story, because nobody could live to 900 years old. Nobody could rule, for for thousands of years. Nobody could live that long. So they don't accept what happened before that, although they do accept, because it's archaeologically proven, what happened after that. Well, when you compare that list, and that's one archaeological example, with what we see geologically, now you're beginning to tell the whole story, is that there have been advanced civilizations. And if we're to believe the Sumerian texts, they were seeded from another world, and they are the ones that are responsible for our genetic intervention, if that's what you want to call that. And this is what Sitchin was talking about, and others have talked about this as well. So I think Antarctica is the big tell right now. There's a lot of conversation around it. It's really interesting because it was declared during the Cold War neutral, that no one could own Antarctica. World War II, Germany started building bases, military bases. Then America did. Now China and a lot of countries have military bases. Iran has recently claimed Antarctica as an Iranian continent. And this just happened a couple of weeks ago. And so, I think, but they won't let people down there. If you try to go down as a reporter and go to the interior of the continent, you're not allowed to go into the continent. What people I know that have been there, what they say is once you go through the ice on the perimeter, that's not what's happening on the inside. It's desert, 0% humidity. I don't even know what that feels like. No magnetic field there because of the way the magnetic poles, you're in the place in between. That would be a really interesting experience to feel what our bodies, because we're deeply attuned to magnetic fields. What would it feel like to be in the absence of a magnetic field? You couldn't take your phone, your computer, things like that. Probably, I don't think they would work there. So you couldn't do a FaceTime from from where that's happening. So, but I think the evidence suggests that these changes happen so quickly that whatever is in place is frozen in time. It's locked in time. So, for example, in Siberia, as a geologist, we've seen this for years. The woolly mammoths, they're now they're gone. But there are, and it's not just one or two. They found a lot of them there. They were like in the middle of a steppe, and they were frozen, or they still had grass in their mouth. They hadn't even swallowed the grass. And the temperature dropped so quickly that they were just frozen in place and then covered over in the glaciers. That appeared to have happened in Antarctica. It was a lush, green, tropical continent and until one of these shifts happened. And when the shifts happened and all of the geophysical parameters, the magnetic poles wandering and all of those things, whatever was there is frozen in place. So presumably, we may have the most intact of the most ancient of archaeological remnants of ancient civilizations from wherever they came from, including their technology, their propulsion systems, their craft, their agriculture, everything preserved in the ice. And I think that is the controversy. That's why they don't want people down there. Are you familiar with Gurdjieff, the philosopher Gurdjieff? Okay.
We were just talking about him last week.
When he, so I won't go into detail because you have to see last week's podcast. Who was talking about it last?
Robert Gilbert.
Robert, okay.
Yeah.
He talked about a place in the Middle East, in the Far East, actually, a monastery where he went to learn what it is that he learned. There are other monasteries. When after the crucifixion of Jesus, the Essenes were persecuted and they fled to four corners of the earth. They went into the highlands of central China, what is now in Tibet. They went into well, into North America, and there's evidence of those in the desert Southwest. It's a whole conversation around that. They went to Egypt, and they went into a part of South America that is near the border of Bolivia and Peru. It's a really heavily dense jungle. And there are two monasteries. One is an outer monastery where if people are lucky enough to find it, they'll be allowed to leave. The inner monastery, the way they keep it secret is if anyone ever finds that monastery, they're invited to stay for the rest of their lives and not allowed to leave. And that's how they keep it secret. And the way to get to that monastery is through a native people in the southern part of Peru. And it's highly, highly protected, very protected down there right now.
So fascinating. There's so much mystery around Shambhala, around these ancient temples and sites. And
I hear there's one in your basement. Is that true?
Yeah, that's what I hear. So man, there's a lot we just opened up there. I think all of this ultimately, and I'd love to try our best to kind of tie into where we started this conversation with all these reflections about the possibilities of these ancient civilizations just point to me, at least, to how much we don't know, how much the standard model has really closed off the potential of these realities, and reflects on the true nature of who we are, where we came from, and that also points to where we are going and what we should protect within our own humanness that we were talking to earlier.
Sure.
So help me kind of tie this back into where we started, and then what we're going to do is soon take a break, and we're going to do a second podcast, which is going to come out the following week from when we're releasing this one, and dive deeper into the human potential, the intelligence of the heart, and really unlocking that. So yeah, I'm just going to kind of throw it back in
I think we covered a lot of details for one big story, same story. And there's so many interesting avenues that we can pursue. I think it's important not to get lost in that pursuit, not to get lost in, I'm sure for some people they're fascinated by Antarctica and they think that's the whole story, but that's a piece, the bigger story. And I think what is important, and the way I'd like to close what we're doing now, is that we are the story. We're the prize. We are the prize. And I began saying this, and now maybe it'll make even more sense. There is a fundamental battle between good and evil that is playing out to capture our humanity, because our humanity is the conduit to our divinity. Ultimately, it's a battle for our divinity. But divinity isn't something that you can touch and hold in your hand. The human body, the temple, is. So the battle that's unfolding has been unfolding through all of the civilizations that we've talked about in different ways. Different levels of power, different levels of control, different levels of fear, different levels of transcending that fear, not surviving, but transcending that fear. And it comes down to our humanness and our willingness to embrace just how rare, how precious, how special, how sacred we are as a species, and that we're worth preserving, in my opinion. I think there's something amidst all the dysfunction and all the hurt and all the anger and all the suffering. There's an essence that I think is worth preserving. One of the things that psychologists have found is that we are actually a kind, gentle, and benevolent species. And people look around and say, what are you talking about? There are 3 conditions where we will betray our truest nature. Our truest nature is kindness, forgiveness. I think we all sense that. We're good. We're a good species. We're good people. When we feel personally threatened, we will lash out and betray our truest nature and hurt others. When we feel that our families or our loved ones are threatened, or when we feel that our way of life is threatened, we will betray our truest nature. And you look at all of the war, all of the hurt and the suffering in the world, and they all fall into one of those 3 categories. people either feel personally threatened, their families, or their way of life is being threatened. The Essenes said this in a beautiful way. Maybe this is how we'll close it. They said the only difference between the angels in the heavens and the angels that walk this earth is that the angels in the heavens remember that they're angels. And what that invites us to consider is that we are the angels walking this earth, and that we've gotten lost in our hurt, in our suffering. And it's through our divinity that we triumph, not win, triumph over all of that. But it all begins with honoring the gift of our bodies. And I think that's the invitation that's up for all of us right now.
Gregg, you're such an incredible orator, communicator of these ideas, and really to be able to synthesize them, to be able to explain in layman's terms what's going on. And there's so many mysteries and avenues we can keep diving down. I mean, I could speak to you for 12 hours straight about all this, and I'm sure we will in due time. But that reflection is very potent, that perhaps we are angels on earth that have forgotten, and we're on this process of remembering. And I would love for this next conversation for people to tune into next week, unveiling that process of remembering. So thank you so much for diving with me in this conversation.
Thank you for sharing the journey and allowing me. I'm just realizing I spoke a lot more than you did. So thank you for allowing long answers to short questions. And I look forward to our next.
I could listen to you all day. So I'm happy with it and excited to keep diving deeper. Everyone who's tuning in, thank you for tuning in. And let us know how this episode uniquely impacted you. I'm excited for next week, you guys to tune in to the continuation of this dialogue between Gregg and I. Thank you for coming on this journey. Until next time, keep well.